It's almost Shavuos time, and on Shavuos we have obviously the receiving of the Torah, and there are other events that took place on Shavuos, or certainly things that we do on Shavuos. First of all, it's a Yontif, and it's family time, and for those who live in Chutz La'aretz, Shavuos involves 2 days of Yontif. In Israel this year, it's a Shabbos, and it's a what do you call it, Shabbos, Yontif before Shabbos. So in Israel, it's also going to be back to back. But for people who live in Chutz La'aretz, it's 2 days automatically. And if there's a Shabbos, sometimes you get the 3-day, what they call the 3-day Yontif. And one of the issues that people sometimes have is, what do we do at the table? What do we do at a Yontif table? So in order to try to help that out, I have over here a booklet which is called How to Run a Shabbos Table. And much of what I've written in this book applies also as well on a Yontif table, as far as how to keep interest in the family. For example, teenagers who are usually disinterested, what type of Dvar Torah should be used, what kind of food presentation, whether or not, how to run things logistically. This is not a Kiruv brochure as much as it's a practically family brochure, which applies for both Shabbos and Yontif. If anybody's interested, I'd be glad to send it. I have this on a file. It's about 28 pages on a file. If anybody's interested in purchasing this, feel free to email me at David B. Kaplan, B as in baseball, David B. Kaplan. And people have found this very helpful, what to do for how parents should deal with kids who are unruly and keeping things organized. Should you have guests? What songs to do? What kind of Zmiros? When to sing Zmiros? From many of the things that many people go through and sometimes are frustrated, especially when there's going to be a series of seudas that you're going to eat. They're going to be a light nighttime, and then during the day, and then the night day, and then you could have it on a 3-day Yontif. You have 6 or 7 times that the family sits together. So it's very important especially for the father, sitting down at the table. What am I trying to do, and how do I go about accomplishing it? And certainly applicable on Shavuos. Again, if anybody's interested in purchasing, you can contact me, David B. Kaplan at Gmail. On Shavuos, we read Megillas Rus. And Megillas Rus, there are different opinions why we read Megillas Rus. One of them is that David HaMelech, when David HaMelech, who is a descendant of Rus, David HaMelech was nifter, he passed away on Shavuos, which happened to be also on Shabbos, and therefore the tradition is to read Megillas Rus. Now the theme of Megillas Rus, the Medrash says, that in Megillas Rus we find something very interesting. There are very few halachas. Most of anything we find in Scripture is going to, certainly in the Chumash, is going to teach us halachas. And the Medrash says, why was this Megillah written? What was the reason that Megillas Rus was written? And the Medrash answers, in order to teach us how important chesed is, because the entire Megillas Rus is about the chesed that was done. Rus does chesed with her mother-in-law, Boaz does chesed with Rus, and the chesed that we find in Megillas Rus eventually brings to the Davidic line, to the Malchus Beis David, to the Davidic dynasty. So the emphasis of Megillas Rus and the whole thrust of Megillas Rus is to teach us how important chesed is in Jewish life. What's remarkable, and we all know that chesed, to do things for people, the idea of chesed, the approach to chesed, by the way, should always be, we say yes unless it's a no. When somebody asks us for a favor, or when somebody needs our help, our approach, our attitude should be, it's yes unless it has to be a no, not no unless we're able to make it a yes. There's an expression nowadays people use, it's not my comfort zone. People use that as a noble excuse not to help other people. Well, it's not my comfort zone. Chesed is rarely in our comfort zone. We don't use comfort zones. Comfort zone, of course, it's difficult sometimes to go and help other people. That's why we're different than everybody else. And that's why we engage in chesed. And unless there are extenuating circumstances that we can't do it, then our attitude is that we do it. What's remarkable in Megillas Rus is that the chesed that we find in the Megillah is chesed among family members. Isn't that interesting? Where do we learn how important chesed is? We learn how important chesed is from people who are doing chesed with family members. And I think that the underlying idea here is that we all know to do chesed with strangers is often very, very, it's certainly inviting. There's a little bit of prestige, and people may say nice things about us, and, a little bit of, it's a little bit more fun. To do chesed in the home, like a husband washing dishes for his wife, or to voluntarily go and do fold the laundry, nobody gives you awards for that, and sometimes you may get a thank you, but nobody's going to go and praise you. Nobody knows about it. There's very little prestige in folding laundry or in fixing cabinets for your spouse or in helping out your parents or whatever it is. And therefore, it's specifically when it comes to family members that the Torah emphasizes, because we have to be that the Megillah emphasizes that we have to be so focused and conscious of the family needs. I heard about a man once who went to a charity collector, and he comes to a fairly well-to-do man, and he says to him, there's a very needy family here in the neighborhood, and they could use some help. It might have been even before a yontif, I don't remember, but he said they could use some help. Maybe you could help them out. The guy says, sure, I'll be glad to. How much do you think you need? He says, about $1,000. He says, no problem. He pulls out his checkbook and he picks up his pen. He says, who should I make the check out to? And the guy looks at him. He says, your brother. It means here's a man who's helping the world, helping everybody else. So what about your nearest and dearest? And therefore, there's always this idea. There's when family, because they know us best, and sometimes we feel, well, do it yourself, and why are you bothering me? Therefore, one of the ideas over here is the idea of doing chesed with the family. Rav Moshe Feinstein, there was a woman who was living in the United States, and she had a sister who was living in Russia. Rav Moshe Feinstein had originally come from Russia, from White Russia. And this woman came to Rav Moshe Feinstein periodically, and she would write a letter, and she would have Rav Moshe Feinstein write it and translate it into Russian so that she could send the letter to her sister. So somebody once asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was the biggest posek of the generation, he was ruling on life-threatening situation, life and death questions, and somebody said to him, is that really the best use of your time to sit and translate a letter for this lady? And Rav Moshe Feinstein said, when it comes to doing chesed, first do the chesed. Then afterwards ask yourself, should I have done it or not? What I think he meant by that was that obviously we can't do everything for everybody all the time. But the instinct to say no, to just say no, it's very easy to say no. First do it. First say yes. Do it. If it wasn't right, so next time you'll tell her, listen, I'm sorry, but you'd have to have somebody else. And Rav Moshe Feinstein was a person who almost never said no to anybody about anything. So that's the first lesson that we learned from Megillas Rus, is the importance of chesed. There's another very important lesson over here, and that is that if you follow the story and you know the story well, and it is a good idea to get familiar with the entire Megillah story before Rus to get an appreciation of who this remarkable lady was and the story of Boaz himself. Rus is told by her mother-in-law, Naomi, who she follows. She attaches herself to her mother-in-law, even though she's a Moabite princess and she's willing to live a life of destitution. And she goes with her mother-in-law and she says to her mother-in-law, I'm going to follow you wherever you go. And at a certain point, they have a wealthy, prominent relative named Boaz. And Naomi sends Rus down to the granary to dress herself up nicely and go at midnight to the granary where Boaz is there. And obviously it is a way of alluding to Boaz that she's interested in him marrying her. Now, if you stop and think about it, when does this take place? It takes place at midnight. And the commentaries explain, what is the Megillah trying to communicate here? There's a very interesting idea the Megillah is trying to communicate, which is that what results from the relationship between Boaz and Rus. They get married, they have a son and a grandson, and the great-grandson is David HaMelech. That means that the king, David HaMelech, which is the line of the Mashiach comes from David HaMelech, that line is produced by the union of Boaz and Rus. Now, why is it done at midnight where the initiative begins? It's a lesson to us. Nighttime always is symbolic of the exile. Midnight is the darkest point of the night. That means in the darkness of exile, when things are bleakest and we're almost at the point where we're ready to give up hope, At that point, what's really taking place? The wheels are being set in motion to bring about the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people, which is Mashiach. So when things look absolutely hopeless and it looks like there's no way out, there's an apocryphal story that's told about a very wealthy Jewish man. And he's got 3 very wealthy sons and 3 very wealthy son-in-laws. And he goes to a Rav, and he says to this Rav, I'm having a faith crisis. He says, what's your faith crisis? He says, listen, I'm fabulously wealthy. My sons are fabulously wealthy. My son-in-laws are fabulously wealthy. I don't see any way God could make me poor. So the Rav says to him, God could do anything at any time. He says, but I just don't understand it. What could possibly happen? A global apocalypse. So then everybody's in trouble. Barring a global disaster, I don't see if I lost my money, my sons would support me. If they lost their money, my son-in-laws would support me. I don't see how God could make me destitute. So the rabbi says, I'm telling you right now, it could happen. The guy says, well, I don't see how. And he leaves. He walks outside. And as he walks outside, he is suddenly gripped by an overwhelming urge to convert to Christianity. Never felt this way before. So he goes over to the local church, and he knocks on the door. The priest answers the door. He says, I want to embrace your religion. There's a guy standing in front of him with a shtreimel, a beard, and payas. I want to embrace your religion. The priest is looking, rolling his eyes. He says, come on, buddy. I know you're just pulling my leg over here. What do you really want? He says, no, that's what I want. He says, well, if that's what you want, you're going to have to show that you're sincere. And he pulls out a form and he says, you're going to have to sign over all your material possessions to the church. That's the only way that'll prove that you're sincere. So the guy says, okay, Yankel Schwartz, sign over all my material possessions to the church. He says, signs it, gives him the document. The priest puts it in the desk, puts it in a drawer, and the guy leaves. He gets back out into the street. And the minute he hits the street, the priest says to him, you come back tomorrow, we'll baptize you. He gets out into the street. The minute he gets into the street, the priest says, the guy loses the urge to convert, leaves him. He thinks to himself, what have I done? What have I done? I'm destitute. I have no money. I've signed it over to the church. When my sons find out about it, they're going to disown me. They're going to sit shiva over me. My son-in-laws aren't going to speak to me. They're going to give me a dime. I'm destitute. I have nothing. He goes back to the rabbi, to the Rav. He says to the Rav, I'm absolutely destitutely poor, and I don't see any way Hashem could get us out of this. Get me out of this. He looks at him, he smiles, he says, haven't we been through this once before today? He says, yeah, but please help me. I don't see any way out. He says, don't worry, Hashem could do anything. And while they're talking, they hear a fire engine. There's a fire in the church, and the church burns down. There's no more church, no more paper, no more priest. He's right back to where he was. It's an apocryphal story. But the point of the story is that we can reach a point where we've given up. We don't see any way out. That's the idea of Rus meeting Boaz at midnight. At the darkest point where things are bleakest, that's the point where the ultimate Yeshua, the ultimate salvation, is starting. The seeds are being planted. That's lesson number 2. And lesson number 3 is one that we have to internalize. Boaz had 60 children. And Boaz, according to the Medrash, lived close to 500 years. He marries Rus. And they get married. And the next morning, Boaz dies. Now, a person looking on, there was a raging debate. Is he allowed to marry her? Or is he not allowed to marry her? She's a Moabite convert. And there was a raging debate in Beis Din. Can he marry her or he shouldn't marry her? And Boaz convinced them that he's allowed to marry her. And he marries her. The next morning he dies. I think even the least cynical person in the world would say, well, guess not. Imagine somebody who 2 people are sitting at a table and the guy says, well, I think that food is treif. I think that food's kosher. No, kosher treif, kosher treif. And the guy says, no, I'm pretty sure it's kosher. And he takes one bite and he chokes. I think everybody would say, well, I guess not. I guess it was treif. So Boaz says, no, you're allowed to marry her. He marries her. The next morning he dies. The next morning. I'm sure most people thought, nope. Yeah, Boaz, I guess it was incorrect. When they found out that the decision was correct? They found out that the decision was correct 4 generations later. When David HaMelech is anointed as king of the Jewish people, at that point everybody sees, what, Boaz was right. Everybody understands that his decision was the correct decision, which then begs another question. So then why did he die the next day? And this is the point that we have to internalize. A person has to know, Boaz had 60 children. We never hear anything about them. Boaz lived close to 500 years. There's very little that we're told about the first 500 years of the first almost 500 years of his life. What do we know about Boaz? On the last day of his life, Boaz accomplished something which the Jewish people now focus on for eternity. That means that a person in life should know it's never too late. We don't know why we're in this world, how long we're going to be here for, and we don't know what in this world is the main purpose, with the main task we've been here for. We only know one thing. We have to spend our life trying to accomplish. Sfiras HaOmer leads up to Shavuos. Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 disciples. They all died during Sfiras HaOmer. And then at the end of his life, he establishes 5 more disciples. And those 5 disciples, from them come the rest of the Torah. He had disciples his entire life, and at the end of his life, it's the ones at the end of his life that bring us the entire Torah. What the Torah is, all of the oral Torah that we have. Kula aliba de Rabbi Akiva. It all came from Rabbi Akiva, from those 5 disciples. The lesson is, there's an elderly man who was at a college on the first day of school. And one of the students turned to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, could I ask you?" He was standing in line. He said, "Why are you here?" He said, "I'm signing up for courses." He says, "Why?" He says, "Well, I never graduated, never went to college, I never graduated. I'd like to get a degree." So the guy looks at him, this young guy looks at him, he says, "Can I ask you a question? How old are you?" He says, "I'm 73. He says, "Well, to get a degree takes 4 years." He says, "Yeah." He says, "Well, in 4 years, you're going to be 77. So the old man looks at him and says, "Yeah, but in 4 years, I'm going to be 77 anyway. I'd rather be 77 with a degree than without a degree." So sometimes in life, a person's afraid to start something, for example, a Daf Yomi. Let's say a man's 35 years old, and he's thinking about starting to learn Daf Yomi. He thinks, "Oh, Daf Yomi, by the time I finish, I'll be 42. In 7 years, I'll be 42. My friend, in 7 years, you're going to be 42 anyway. Would you rather be 42 with Shas or 42 without Shas? And the lesson from Boaz and Rus is, from Boaz, 500 years, the last day of your life, the most significant one. All those children, and it's that one unborn child when you died that is then going to become the ancestor of the entire Davidic line. The lesson of Shavuos is, it's never too late. We were put here to accomplish, and we have to keep on accomplishing, regardless of age, regardless of stage. We have to keep going on. That is one of the lessons of the Megillah, and that is one of the ideas of receiving the Torah on Shavuos, that we're put here to grow, to accomplish, and to continue growing as Torah Jews.